China is to impose tariffs on U.S. imports, including crude oil and coal. The measures are in retaliation for tariffs levied by President Donald Trump, which have just come into force against Beijing. But Trump has suspended action against Mexico and Canada for 30 days in return for border security concessions.
U.S. President Donald Trump's tariff offensive on Chinese goods sparked an immediate counterstrike from Beijing, escalating the trade conflict with renewed economic firepower. As an additional 10% tariff across all Chinese imports into the U.S. came into effect Tuesday midnight, and within minutes, China's finance ministry said it would impose levies of 15% for U.S. coal and LNG and 10% for crude oil, farm equipment, and a small number of trucks, as well as big-engine sedans, shipped to China from the United States. China's retaliatory tariff package and a lawsuit it filed against the U.S. to the World Trade Organization was announced on Chinese state TV. A spokesperson for the Ministry of Commerce stated today that the U.S. imposition of tariffs on Chinese products seriously violates WTO rules, has a bad nature, and is a typical unilateralism and trade protectionism practice. The actions of the U.S. seriously damage the rules-based multilateral trading system, undermine the foundation of economic and trade cooperation between China and the U.S. China's market regulator has also launched an antitrust investigation into Google over alleged violations of the country's anti-monopoly law as part of its retaliation package. Google's search engine services in China was banned in 2010, and it has only a limited presence there. As the US and China lock horns, the EU watches warily, bracing for potential economic fallout. With Trump hinting at tariffs on the EU next, the global trade battleground is likely to see more clashes with growing intensity.
And joining us now, we have China analyst Fraser Howie. Good to see you, Fraser. You, of course, have followed the Chinese economy for years and written several books on China's financial system. We're so glad to have you on DW News. Now, China has imposed retaliatory tariffs on what seem to be a smaller set of U.S. imports. What will that mean for China's economy?
Well, of course, it's very early days. There'll be a rather limited impact to start with. And of course, these are things, certainly when it's the oil and gas sector, these are things that China needs. So they don't particularly want to be putting tariffs on anything like that. But the bigger question that everyone needs to ask is, what is the point of these? What's Trump actually trying to achieve here? Because we heard yesterday, and you mentioned in your report, the Mexican tariffs have been suspended for 30 days because, as one of his team said, they're not really tariffs about trade, they're about the drugs war. So this is actually a way of sort of trying to leverage the fentanyl problem in the States. Is this what he's trying to do with China as well? Is he trying to rebalance trade? I'm not entirely clear what he's doing, but at the moment, the impact's going to be pretty limited.
And do you see it as a bargaining tactic to try and leverage concessions on something else from China?
Well, it could be. That's the point. You know, Trump loves to talk. When you listen to him, everything's a deal. Everything's a deal. He thinks he's a great deal maker. He sort of threatens people. He tries to bully people, all trying to get a great deal. But as I say, it's not at all clear to me what actually the deal is here. It's not as if we haven't been here before. Let's remember the Phase 1 trade deal that was meant to lead on to the Phase 2 trade deal. Trump's deficit with China actually increased while he was in office. So, his success in this of using tariffs to get what he wants is pretty limited. And it's a very blunt measure if he's trying to sort of rebalance his trade with China or, frankly, with any other country.
So perhaps difficult to exactly put our finger on exactly what it is Trump is hoping to achieve here. But what about from China's perspective? What would you say Beijing's strategy will be going forward if this turns out to be the trade war that everyone seems to be fearing?
Sure. I think obviously this time Beijing was very prepared for the tariffs. It certainly shouldn't have come as a surprise. I say this is it's not a complete rerun of Trump 1, but we have seen this before. He loves the word tariffs. He's said that many times. And Beijing obviously was prepared. They had a list of things to go after. There obviously are many other things they could go after. They could go and close down Musk's factory in Shanghai. I'm sure that would really cause a stir in the White House and have Elon panicking a bit. So there's plenty of leverage the Chinese still have. but they're much better prepared. They don't want this, of course. They're very dependent on exports. They're also dependent on a number of imports as well. So they're prepared. They're going to try and tough this out, but they're simply not going to back down. China is not Colombia, who's going to basically fold within within a few hours of a threat of tariffs. They're going to certainly push back and certainly try and get a better deal. But as I say, what the deal we're actually trying to achieve is far from certain.
Now, in recent years, we have seen China reduce its economic dependency on the U.S. and boost ties elsewhere in the world. Is that part of their preparation for something like this coming out of the Trump administration?
Well, I think one of the things that actually what Trump 1 did was actually force a lot of manufacturing out of China into places like Vietnam. And guess what? Now, America now has a great big trade deficit with Vietnam because they've moved part of that. What was being manufactured in China is now being manufactured in Vietnam and still going to the States. So yes, on a bilateral level, things have changed. But this is the problem of just looking at bilateral trade. It's only part of the picture. And we know that supply chains are extremely global still. It's not as if everything's got resourced to America. We know that just with the discussion of Mexico and Canada, there's a tremendous movement of goods being processed, going backwards and forwards across these borders, depending on what part of the process they are. So as I say, simply having a bilateral trade measure or trade tariffs between the two countries is a very blunt instrument to try and tackle trade imbalances, if indeed that is what Trump is after.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today on DW News with your insights. That is China analyst Fraser Howie. And we can speak to DW's correspondent James Chater in Taipei for more. James, tell us more about what we know so far about these tariffs that Beijing has imposed on U.S. products.
Well, alongside those headline energy measures unveiled by Beijing today, really coming alongside a host of other measures targeting U.S. interests. Chief amongst those, an anti-monopoly probe into Google, as well as a number of U.S. companies being placed on what China calls an unreliable entities list. This is a list where companies who are part of may face difficulties investing in China and doing business dealings with China. One thing to look at really closely, though, is that the details of these measures have become clear over the course of today. Are 5 critical metals that China is looking to impose export controls, and chief amongst those that people are looking at is tungsten. Now, tungsten is a metal which is used in a multiple of different arenas, chiefly in defense industries and aviation industries, and also in electronics industries. China exports some 80% of this metal, and so this really is one of those areas where China is looking to pack a punch, it would seem, to US interests. But in speaking with analysts over the course of today, they have repeatedly emphasized that despite this quick retaliation that we've seen from Beijing, in the grand scheme of things, this remains a pretty measured response. The door seems to remain open to talks, and as you mentioned, we are expecting Donald Trump and Chinese leaders to speak in the coming days. Both sides potentially hoping to avoid more extreme measures before that February 10th deadline, when some of these tariffs are meant to come into force.
So let's take a look at those U.S. tariffs also. Now that they've gone into effect, what is the immediate impact of these measures for China?
Well, of course, one of the key things that the US will be looking to target is China's export capacity. Exports are a really central part of economic growth in China, and another really key thing they'll be looking at is making it more difficult for supply chains to be based in China. Of course, this is something that a lot of companies that have previously had operations in China over the past couple of years have been looking to diversify away from, and I think this renewed trade anxieties will only accelerate efforts to potentially move some of their operations outside of China. But remember, these two economies, both the US and China, are in very different positions from that initial trade war that began during Trump's first administration. China, especially in that respect, given that over the past couple of years, it's experienced really sluggish growth because of that drag from the property sector. And so China, I think, again, this is why we're looking at that more measured response, that more targeted response to US tariffs to try and mitigate the impact and try and stop this from escalating any further.
Now, Beijing also has deep economic ties around Asia. Are other Asian countries keeping an eye on this situation, wondering whether they might be next?
Absolutely. Well, of course, Asian economies are extremely interlinked. Most Asian economies count China as their largest trading partner, and so there will be, of course, concerns that the imposition of these tariffs might mean a dampening of Chinese consumer demand, already pretty depressed over the past couple of years, and what that might mean for economies around the region. But interestingly, what Asian economies might also be looking at is concerns around what Donald Trump might do. Of course, Trump has expressed the reasons that he's imposed these tariffs on China are really centered on the fentanyl trade. But of course, he's expressed frustration with any country that has a trade surplus with the United States. And 7 of the 10 countries that have the biggest trade surpluses with the United States are in Asia, including key US allies like Japan and South Korea. And so they will be looking at the current situation and very concerned about what Trump might do, imposing tariffs on them as well.
Well, thank you so much for that update. That is DW's James Chater in Taipei.
And for some more analysis, I'm joined now in the studio by Clifford Coonan from DW Business. Clifford lived in China and reported from there over many years. Welcome, Clifford. Do you get a sense that China could ultimately benefit from what is happening now?
I think this is, it's an open question in some ways because the Chinese economy is sluggish at the moment. It's facing a property slowdown. It's facing all kinds of issues like this. It's looking at exports as a way out of trouble because Chinese consumers aren't spending money. So in some ways it could benefit from maybe playing the aggrieved party internationally. But I think overall this is going to be problematic for China because it is heavily reliant on exports and it needs those to keep the economy growing at a time when it's facing these headwinds.
There's also a nearly $1 trillion trade deficit between the US and China. This is a point that Donald Trump brings up quite often. Does he think that in some ways these tariffs imposed on China will help address this imbalance?
I think he does. And if you look at the numbers, he has a point. I mean, it is nearly $1 trillion. They were inflated by the fact that a lot of people bought heavily towards the end of last year because they knew the tariffs were coming. Then again, it's 10%. As James points out, there's already existing tariffs, probably of around 20%. So you're talking about 30% already. But it's hard to shake off the sense that this is only the opening salvo because he's already focused so much on Mexico, on Canada, and on things like Panama, where he thinks there's too much Chinese influence. And in each of these 3 cases, he's had a kind of a win in many ways. He's had people step down. In Panama, they've withdrawn from China's Belt and Road Initiative for infrastructure. And then in Canada and Mexico, you've also seen them moving towards Trump's position. So I think he thinks that he can push this with China as well. But I do sense strongly this is only the opening salvo in what's coming.
Do you think that China is better insulated, let's put it that way, better insulated against these tariffs this time round, given that they've had nearly about 8 years to sort of prepare for this? I mean, isn't China trading with a lot more other countries now and investing heavily in a lot more other countries? And hasn't the importance of the US as a trade partner slightly diminished over the years?
It has, but at the same time, it's very reliant on the US. What it has done, it's increased the level of manufacturing is much higher now. It's exporting much more high-end goods. For example, 1/3 of pharmaceuticals in the US are made in China now. It's not just widgets and patio furniture anymore. You're seeing e-vehicles. You're seeing all of these kind of things which are going all over the world. And so in some ways that puts China into a stronger position. At the same time, it's still very reliant on the US because it's still the biggest economy in the world and its supply chains are very much geared towards supplying the US market.
So these are the opening salvos in a potential trade war. Is this going to make other countries in Asia jittery?
I think so. Everyone is jittery. And obviously countries like India are watching this closely. Southeast Asia is watching this closely. Japan, South Korea, with their huge car exports to the US are watching this very closely. in some ways, he said a lot during the campaign about the BRICS, so Brazil and Russia and India and South Africa and China, of course. In some ways, I think he's taking aim at those particularly. He's also mentioned South Africa in recent days. During the campaign, he mentioned 100% tariffs. He did also mention that Spain was a member of BRICS, but we have to presume he meant South Africa. So I think this is part of this opening salvo is definitely the fact that this is just an opening salvo is making other countries nervous. And when he starts talking about the BRICS and he's looking very closely at Latin America, all of these, it's becoming a global question, and he sees tariffs very much as the tool with which to fight this war.
We'll leave it there for the moment. China specialist from DW Business, Clifford Coonan. Thanks so much.